The rope was a coarse, living thing against her skin. It bit into her wrists where she was tied to the hitching post, the raw hemp a constant reminder of her father's judgment. The sun beat down on the crown of her head, hot and white, bleaching the world of its color until all that was left was dust and the hard lines of the buildings that framed the town square. She kept her eyes on a point just beyond the shingled roof of the mercantile, a place in the empty, shimmering air where no one's gaze could meet hers. Her name, the one she was born with, had been scoured away. She was now just the girl, a title spoken in murmurs that skittered at the edge of her hearing like mice in a wall. She felt the weight of their stares, some curious, some contemptuous, some laced with a pity that was worse than the hate. She had become a spectacle, a lesson. Her belly, still just a gentle swell beneath the thin fabric of her dress, was the core of her sin. The crowd shifted and muttered. They had come for the theater of it, the raw, ugly drama of a family's honor being publicly mended. She could feel them losing interest, the heat of the day winning out over the novelty of her shame. They started to drift away in twos and threes, back to their chores and their suppers, leaving her in a dwindling circle of the truly pious and the truly cruel. Her father stood near the steps of the assay office, his arms crossed over his chest. Jedediah was a man carved from hard wood and harder pride, and she was a splinter he was determined to pluck out. He had not spoken to her since dragging her from the house, his silence a heavier condemnation than any blow. His face was a mask of righteousness, but she saw the flicker of something else in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a frantic shame, a fear of what the neighbors would whisper. A blight, he'd called her. He'd said it to the preacher, his voice loud enough for the whole congregation to hear. A blight on a decent house. Now he cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the thinning quiet. She has brought disgrace to my name, he announced to the remaining onlookers, his voice sharp as a shard of glass. She is a vessel of sin, and my house will not shelter it. She is without worth. Worthless. He spat the word onto the dust at his feet. She did not flinch. She had built a wall inside herself, brick by silent brick, and his words bounced off it, falling away into the vast, indifferent quiet of the plains. She had nothing left to give them, not a tear, not a plea. She was a stone. Then, a shadow detached itself from the wall of the smithy. It was long and solid, and it moved with a deliberateness that drew the eye. A man. He was immense, a giant built of broad shoulders and long limbs, wrapped in a worn, dust-colored duster that fell nearly to his ankles. His face was obscured by the brim of a stained hat, but as he drew closer, she saw it was weathered as old leather, etched with lines the sun and sorrow had carved there. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He stopped a few feet from her father, his presence sucking the air from the square. The few remaining townsfolk went still. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on Jedediah. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind, a low moan that stirred the dust into little ghosts. Jedediah puffed out his chest, a bantam rooster facing a hawk. "What business is it of yours, Silas?" The big man, Silas, didn't answer immediately. He reached into a pocket of his duster and his hand emerged with a few coins. They were dull, worn smooth with use. He held them out. The silence stretched, thin as a fence rail. "I'll take her," Silas said. His voice was low and rough, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards. It was not a question or a bargain. It was a statement. Jedediah stared at the coins, then at the man's unreadable face. A flicker of something, confusion, insult, relief, crossed his features. He saw the finality in Silas's posture. He saw a way to be rid of the problem, to cast the splinter out for good. He snatched the coins from Silas's palm, the metal clinking faintly. The transaction was done. It was as simple and as brutal as the sale of livestock. Silas turned then, and for the first time, he looked at her. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no judgment, no pity, nothing she could name. They just saw her. He stepped forward, and she flinched, expecting a rough hand. Instead, he pulled a pocketknife from his coat. The blade caught the afternoon sun in a brief, sharp flash. With two swift, clean motions, he sliced through the ropes at her wrists. The fibers fell away, and a searing relief shot through her arms. She rubbed the raw, red grooves on her skin, her hands trembling. He took a step back, giving her space. He gestured with his head toward the edge of town. "Come on." He turned and started walking without looking back to see if she followed. For a heartbeat, she remained frozen by the post, the ghost of the rope still clinging to her. Then her legs, stiff and clumsy, began to move. She followed the tall, silent man, putting one bare foot in front of the other, away from the square, away from her father, away from the life that had discarded her. The dust lifted behind them like a closing curtain. The journey was a silent one. He walked ahead, his long strides eating up the dry, cracked earth. He never spoke, never looked back, but he set a pace a weary woman could keep. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the vast, empty sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The wind turned mean, whipping her thin dress against her legs and tangling her hair across her face. Once, he stopped. He unhooked a canteen from his belt and held it out to her. She hesitated, her throat a knot of thirst and fear. His hand remained steady, an offering without expectation. She finally took it, her trembling fingers brushing against his calloused ones. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the first act of kindness she had known in months. She drank until her thirst was a dull ache instead of a fire, then handed it back. He nodded once and they continued on. They walked until the last light had bled from the sky, and the world was rendered in shades of gray and black. A small shape began to form in the distance, a hard, dark block against the softer darkness of the plains. As they drew closer, she saw it was a house. It was a simple, weathered structure of sod and timber, sitting alone under the enormous, star-dusted sky. It looked less like a home and more like something that had grown out of the land itself, tough and solitary. A low rise stood behind the house, and on its crest, a single wooden cross tilted against the wind. The sight of it sent a cold spike through her. Silas pushed open the door, which groaned in protest. He stepped inside and struck a match, the sudden flare of light making her blink. He lit a lantern on a rough-hewn table, and a pool of unsteady golden light pushed back the shadows. The inside of the house was like the man, stark, functional, and clean. There was a stone hearth, a table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few plates and tins. The air smelled of wood smoke, dust, and a deep, settled loneliness. He gestured toward a small, curtained-off alcove. "That's yours," he then pointed to a bucket of water and a tin basin on a stand. He moved to the hearth, adding wood to the embers from a small pile. He worked with an economy of motion, his large hands gentle and sure. He laid a loaf of dark bread and a hunk of cheese on the table. He did not invite her to eat, but the offering was clear. She moved to the table, her legs aching, and sat on one of the chairs. He took the other, and they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind against the walls. The food was plain, but it filled a hollowness inside her that went deeper than hunger. When they were done, he stood and took a thick, woolen blanket from a chest at the foot of his bed. He laid it on the cot in the alcove. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I don't lock my doors," he said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. It was not a threat, but a promise. A promise of what, she wasn't sure. Freedom. Safety. She retreated behind the curtain, the coarse fabric a fragile wall between them. She lay down on the cot, pulling the heavy blanket over her. It smelled of wood smoke and clean wool. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see his silhouette as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He was a mountain of a man, solid and still. For the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of the dark. She closed her eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the sound of the fire a steady heartbeat in the quiet house. The days fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. A fragile, unspoken routine began to form, a way of living side by side without the need for words. She would wake to the smell of wood smoke and find he was already gone, out to the fences or the lean-to that served as a barn. She would sweep the packed earth floor, her movements slow and deliberate, erasing their footprints from the day before. She found a small, untended garden behind the house, choked with weeds but holding the ghosts of old rows. She began to work it, pulling the stubborn weeds with her bare hands, turning the soil, feeling the grit under her fingernails. It was mindless work that quieted the noise in her head. She found a few tenacious herbs, their leaves dusty but fragrant. He would return at midday, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. They would eat in their customary silence. He never commented on the work she did, the swept floor, the washed plates, the slowly clearing garden, but he would leave a bucket of fresh water for her, or a tool she might need laid carefully by the door. These were their conversations, carried on in gestures and objects. One afternoon, a sharp wind blew in from the north, carrying the first real chill of autumn. She was by the house, her thin dress offering little protection. He came from the barn, holding a heavy wool shawl. It was dark gray, finely woven but worn soft with age. He held it out to her. She took it, wrapping it around her shoulders. The warmth sank into her bones. Her eyes met his for a moment, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back before turning to his work. Another day, drawn by a pull she didn't understand, she walked up the low rise to the solitary grave. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it smoothed by wind and rain until it was almost illegible. Eliza. She knelt and began to clear the weeds that grew around its base. When she was done, she found a single, stubborn prairie wildflower, a spot of defiant purple in the sea of brown grass, and laid it on the packed earth. She did not know who Eliza was, but she knew what it was to be alone in this vast, empty land. When she came back to the house, he was standing in the doorway, watching her. He said nothing, but the air between them had changed. It was lighter, somehow. That evening, the silence at the table was less a void and more a shared space, a comfortable quiet between two people who understood solitude. She began to hum sometimes as she worked, quiet, fractured melodies from a life she barely remembered. She was mending one of his shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, when she realized what she was doing. The sound died in her throat. He was sitting across the room, sharpening a blade, but his hands had stilled. He didn't look at her, just resumed the long, smooth strokes of the whetstone after a moment. But he had heard. He had noticed. One night, she baked bread. She found the flour and yeast in a tin and worked the dough on the table, the motions clumsy at first, then more certain, returning to her from a distant memory. The house filled with the warm, rich smell of it. When she pulled the loaf from the small oven beside the hearth, it was a little lopsided and darker than it should have been. She set it on the table between them. He cut a piece with his knife and chewed it slowly. He looked at the bread, then at her. "A little dry," he said, his voice flat. She felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, a prickle of the old shame. She looked down at her hands. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, his voice just as low. She looked up. A tiny, almost invisible crinkle touched the corner of his eye. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was the closest thing to it she had ever seen on his face. A small, dry joke. A shared observation. That loaf died in vain, she heard herself whisper, the words rusty in her throat. He finished his piece and cut another. "This one will do." That night, the past came for her. A dream of the hitching post, the jeering faces closing in, her father's voice booming like thunder. She cried out, a raw, strangled sound, and woke up tangled in the blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark and cold. She heard a floorboard creak outside her curtain. She held her breath, seized by a primal fear. "You all right?" His voice came from the other side of the fabric, low and steady. She couldn't answer, could only manage a choked sob. He didn't pull the curtain back. He didn't invade her space. He just stood there, his silent presence a bulwark against the darkness. She heard him settle onto the floor, his back against the wall just outside her alcove. He was guarding her. He stayed there until the frantic rhythm of her heart slowed, and the gray light of dawn began to seep through the window. Later that day, as they sat by the fire while a cold rain lashed against the house, she found the courage to ask. "Why?" she asked, her voice thin. "Why did you take me?" He stared into the flames for a long time, the firelight dancing across the harsh planes of his face. She thought he wouldn't answer. "I owed a debt," he said finally, his gaze still on the fire. "Not to your father." To her, he nodded his head slightly in the direction of the grave on the hill. "I wasn't there for her when the fever took her. Or the boy." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. He had carried not one winter in his eyes, but two. A wife and a son. "I saw him," Silas continued, his voice rough with memory. "Your father. I saw his pride. And I saw you. And I figured the world had enough ghosts. Didn't need another." He turned his head and looked at her, really looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the vast, barren landscape of his own loss. She understood, then. This wasn't about pity. It was about seeing a wrong and trying to right it, a quiet, desperate attempt to build something new from the ash of what he had lost. It was a way of stitching their broken lives together with raw thread, hoping the seams would hold. She nodded, a wave of understanding washing over her, so profound it left her breathless. He had not rescued a victim. He had recognized a survivor. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The autumn sky was a high, pale blue, stretched thin over the plains. A change was coming. She could feel it in the way the wind had shifted, carrying a scent of distant dust that was different from the usual smell of the earth. It came in the late afternoon. A smudge on the horizon, slowly resolving itself into 3 riders. Silas was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar part of her day. He stopped mid-swing, his head lifted, his body gone utterly still. He stared toward the riders, and she saw his shoulders tense, his whole posture hardening into a defensive line. She came to stand in the doorway of the house, the wool shawl clutched tight around her. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile peace she had built. She knew who it was. The past had a long memory and a cruel reach. They rode directly for the house, their horses kicking up plumes of yellow dust. Her father, Jedediah, was in the lead, flanked by 2 men from the town, their faces grim and set. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from where Silas stood, the axe still held loosely in his hand. The creak of saddle leather was loud in the sudden silence. "Silas," Jedediah said, his voice carrying an authority he did not possess on this land. "I've come for what is mine." Silas didn't move. He just watched them, his eyes narrowed. "She's not yours." "She is my blood," Jedediah spat, his face flushing with anger. "She carries my name. The shame is mine to deal with." He looked past Silas, his eyes landing on her in the doorway. His gaze was cold, possessive. "The preacher says she can be redeemed. A good marriage, a man willing to take her on. Mr. Abernathy's nephew. He's agreed. It is all arranged." She felt the air leave her lungs. To be passed along again, another transaction, her life a commodity to be traded to settle the accounts of men's pride. The wall she had built inside herself began to crumble. "Her shame is her own," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And her life is her own. You sold that right for a handful of coins. Get off my land." That was for her keep, not for her soul. Jedediah's voice rose, cracking with frustration. He swung down from his horse, taking a step forward. She is property of my house until she is property of another's. That is the law. That is the way of things. The two men with him shifted uneasily, their hands resting on the pommels of their saddles. They were here as witnesses, as the weight of the community, to enforce the proper order of the world. Silas took a deliberate step forward, placing himself squarely between Jedediah and the house. Between Jedediah and her. He was a mountain, immovable. The axe in his hand no longer looked like a tool. It looked like a weapon. The way of things is changing today, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Turn your horse and ride away, Jedediah. It was then that she moved. The fear was still there, a wild thing beating in her chest, but something else rose with it. A fire. It was the fire of the wildflower on the grave, of the warm bread in the oven, of the shared silence by the hearth. It was the fire he had so carefully banked and tended inside her. She stepped out of the doorway, out from behind his shadow, and stood in the open sunlight. Her chin was lifted. She felt the weight of the new life inside her, not as a shame, but as a fact. As a future. Jedediah's eyes widened in surprise as he saw her. He had expected the broken, silent creature he had tied to a post. He did not recognize this woman. Get back in the house, he commanded, his voice shaking with rage. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. The words came from a place deep inside her she thought had been destroyed. They were quiet, but they cut through the tense air like a blade. No, she said. Just that. One word. But it was everything. It was the undoing of a lifetime of silence. It was the claiming of herself. Jedediah stood there, stunned into silence. He looked from her defiant face to Silas's unyielding one. He saw not a giant and his property, but a wall. A fortress. He saw two people bound by something stronger than blood or law. He saw he had no power here. The brittle shell of his pride cracked. He was a small man, shouting at a storm. With a curse, he turned, his movements jerky and defeated. He hauled himself back onto his horse. You'll regret this, he snarled, but the threat was hollow. Both of you. You'll be outcasts. We already are, Silas said softly, to the wind. Her father and his men wheeled their horses around and rode away, their departure as sudden as their arrival. They did not look back. She and Silas stood there, watching until the dust they raised had settled back into the earth, leaving the horizon clean and empty again. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. She was trembling, the aftermath of the fire that had coursed through her. Silas turned slowly to face her. He looked at her, his stormy eyes searching her face. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hesitating for a moment before it gently touched her arm. It was the first time he had touched her with such clear, simple intent. It was not a gesture of rescue or provision. It was a gesture of connection. A quiet affirmation. I was scared, she whispered, the confession a crack in her composure. I know, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. You didn't run. He drew his hand back and walked to the woodpile, picking up the axe as if to resume his work. But he just stood there, holding it, his back to her. She watched the rigid line of his shoulders slowly soften. The battle was over. They had won. They stood together on their small patch of land, two outcasts under a wide, silent sky, and the house behind them felt, for the first time, like a home. In the quiet days that followed, the unspoken contract between them was rewritten. The air in the small house was different, charged with the power of what they had faced together. The silence was no longer a space to be navigated, but a comfort to be shared. The raw thread stitching their lives together had been tested and had held, forming a bond stronger than steel. One evening, he sat by the fire, carving a small piece of cottonwood with his knife. She watched the shavings fall to the floor, her hands resting on the growing swell of her belly. He worked with intense concentration, his large hand surprisingly deft. "What is it?" she asked softly. He held it up. It was a small, crudely carved bird, its wings half spread. He ran his thumb over the smooth wood. "Lena," he said, not looking at her. "It was my mother's name. She liked birds." The name hung in the firelit air between them. Lena. It was a gift, offered so quietly she almost missed its meaning. He was not naming the carving. He was naming her. He was giving her a place in his world, a root in his history. She felt tears well in her eyes, hot and sudden. They were not tears of sorrow or shame, but of a strange, overwhelming gratitude. She was no longer the girl, she was Lena. "It's a beautiful name," she managed to say, her voice thick. He set the bird on the mantelpiece and finally looked at her. His gaze dropped to her stomach, and a softness entered his expression that transformed his harsh features. He took a step toward her and knelt, his movements slow, uncertain. He reached out a hand, hesitating just inches from her. She took his hand in both of hers and guided it to rest on the curve of her belly. His palm was warm and rough against the thin fabric of her dress. He held it there, still and reverent, as if listening for a secret. A faint flutter, a tiny kick, answered his touch. His eyes widened slightly, a look of profound wonder dawning on his face. "And this one will have a name, too," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "A good one." That night, a new beginning was sealed not with vows or ceremony, but with a shared promise in the quiet dark. He had not taken her in to save her from shame, but to find a reason to live beyond his own ghosts. And she had not come here to be rescued, but to find the strength to rescue herself. A week later, she took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one that still held the memory of the rope and the dust of the town square. She carried it to the hearth. Without a word, she dropped it into the flames. They watched together as the fabric curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And something new was there, in that small house, growing stronger with every shared meal, every quiet glance, every beat of the tiny heart she carried within her. Months passed. Winter came, blanketing the plains in a sheet of clean, white snow that silenced the world. The house became their entire universe, a warm, firelit haven against the howling wind. The small bird on the mantel watched over them. The grave on the hill was a gentle mound under the snow, a memory at peace. Spring arrived with a rush of meltwater and the greening of the prairie. The air grew soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. Lena was heavy now, her movements slow and graceful. She would sit on the small porch Silas had built, feeling the sun on her face, while he worked the land, preparing it for planting. The house behind them no longer felt empty. It seemed to breathe with them, its wooden bones settled and content. It was a place of quiet purpose. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon in a final, glorious blaze of color, he came and sat on the step beside her. He didn't speak, just rested his arm along the back of the bench, his hand hovering near her shoulder. They watched the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The house was quiet, the land was quiet, and their hearts were quiet. It was a peace that had been hard-won, built from the rubble of two broken lives. It was not a grand love story, written in sonnets and declarations, but a quiet one, written in shared bread, a wool shawl, a mended fence, and a name spoken by the fire. It was the truest love she had ever known. He put his hand on her shoulder, a simple, solid weight, and together they watched the night unfold. So you see, this story, it isn't just about a rescue. It's not about a knight saving a damsel, or a strong man protecting a weak woman. It's about the quiet courage it takes to see the worth in something the world has thrown away. It's about two people, so shattered they thought they were nothing but sharp edges, finding a way to fit together and make a whole. It's a story about the difference between a house and a home. A house is just walls and a roof, a place to keep the rain out. But a home is a place that sees you. A place where you can lay down your armor, where you can show your scars without fear. A place where you are given a new name, not to cover the old one, but to make room for who you are becoming. Most of us walk around carrying our own ghosts, our own silent shames, our own names we wish we could forget. We build walls and learn to live in the quiet. But every now and then, if you are very brave, and very lucky, you might find another soul who speaks your same language of silence. Someone who doesn't try to fix you, but simply stands with you against the storm, offering a blanket and an unlocked door. That is where the real healing begins. Not in being saved, but in being seen. Not in being claimed, but in finally being given the space to claim yourself. It's a quiet, stubborn kind of love, the kind that can take root in the harshest soil and, against all odds, find a way to bloom.